minutes.
Sí, cámara, ¿verdad? Porque tengo que hablar, ¿vale?
Hello and welcome to everyone. Make yourself at home. We hope you'll introduce yourselves in the chat box. We'll give still 1 more minute for people who are joining us. But in the meantime, let me give you just a little bit of housekeeping instructions. Of course, this webinar, as we're expecting upwards of 75 people joining us, we will not verbally give the floor to the participants, but you at any time please use the chat box, and you can also put questions for any of the speakers, and those will be addressed in the latter part of the session today. So most of you are muted and your camera does not show you, but do feel free to connect with each other or to put the comments. And you can also address them to a particular panelist if you'd like. So welcome, and we will start in just 1 minute. Hello and good afternoon to all of you. Thank you for joining us today in this panel. I'm very excited about this session with some wonderful speakers. This is the first of 3 webinars by Habitat for Humanity in the series of Building Solid Ground for the EU-Africa Partnership. And this is the first session on best practices of housing and urban renewal in Africa. And we want to start off our session today by introducing Rick Hathaway, who will give us welcoming words and introduction. Rick is the Vice President of Habitat for Humanity of Europe, Africa, and Middle East. And previous to that, he was for 25 years in the same post in Asia, where they have put in place some interesting innovations and multi-stakeholder partnerships. So Rick, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Caroline. Colleagues, welcome. It's my pleasure to welcome you to this first session of this collaboration, a webinar series on the EU-Africa Partnership. Today, our discussion focuses on possibilities to unlock sustainable growth and innovation in Africa. We'll look at this topic through the lens of housing and urban renewal. An adequate home, a decent home, can have transformational impact on individuals and communities. A decent home provides a safe place to foster stability, security, and opportunity for its residents. I've seen this through Habitat's work with families and communities around the world, and I know we've all seen this through our collective experiences in the shelter sector. Habitat for Humanity began in 1976 and has grown into a leading global housing nonprofit working in more than 70 countries. In Africa, we have housing programs and partnerships in Côte d'Ivoire, Ethiopia, Kenya, Lesotho, Liberia, Malawi, South Africa, Tanzania, Uganda, and Zambia. In Europe, we work in 10 EU member states and 4 other countries in the region. The importance of housing has been revealed during the COVID-19 pandemic more than ever. We all are working from home. Children are attending school from home. And the home is our protection from a deadly virus and critical for sustaining future generations. Yet an estimated 1.6 billion people live without adequate shelter, including over 1 billion in informal settlements. Some 2.2 billion people live without improved sanitation, and 2 billion are affected by water stress. The coronavirus pandemic has made the urgency of dealing with these problems even more acute. Increasing the public and private investment in housing solutions can have a positive ripple effect across geographies. Housing can be used as a mechanism to boost economic recovery, provide employment opportunities, and stabilize public health. From our work across Africa, we see exciting opportunities in the housing sector. Habitat has been exploring production of innovative local construction materials, alternative housing designs, water and sanitation and hygiene, securing land tenure and developing housing microfinance. These advances have a strong impact on social change, reduce poverty, and create sustainable development outcomes for families and communities. The sector, though, does need more partnerships and more collaboration to scale key solutions and innovation. Habitat for Humanity has been an active voice in national and international advocacy to ensure SDG 11, housing and land, are prioritized in commitments and funding. We actively contributed to the EU position on Habitat 3 and to the new urban consensus on development. We've worked with media to raise awareness about housing and international development. For the past 3 years, through a grant from the European Union, we have led 14 partners across 7 European countries to provide education and awareness opportunities for citizens about development and engage Europeans in actions to address global housing and land rights in the context of rapid urbanization. We firmly believe in the importance of strong partnerships with people, the public, and the private sector. It is exciting to have a group of colleagues with such experience present today, and we look forward to the discussion on sustainable development in Africa. I want to give special thanks to Cities Alliance and UN Habitat, our collaborators, for the entire series of webinars on the EU-Africa partnership, and the European Union for financial support of the Building Solid Ground project, of which this is a part. This session will also launch the compendium of best practices for housing in Africa, produced by Habitat for Humanity in the framework of the Build Solid Ground project. Once again, thank you for joining us, and thank you to our colleagues, our panelists here, and we look forward to the discussion to follow. Thank you.
Thank you, Rick. Welcome to all of those who have joined us in the last few minutes. So from my side, I don't know if this is the case for you, but if I imagine myself building my own house for my family, my dream would be to have an app where I can just go there and right away find the best construction workers, find the best prices, the best material, and get my land title, get my financing sorted out. And then my dream would be print out my house in 3D in 3 days. Of course, with materials that are environmentally sound. So I don't know if that's a visualization some of you have. Some of these things are already happening in some parts of the world. But of course, we are here today because the conditions at the moment are quite the opposite for many families around Africa. Now, Rick mentioned just how much having a house influences the entire lives of families, and all the other ripple effects that it has. But the conditions at the moment, and many of you who are joining us know about this, are really showing us barriers and gaps that may seem sometimes unsurmountable. It may even seem that we might not solve them in any of our children's lifetime. And we talk here about problems of access to land, tenure, security, credit, affordable materials, construction workers that are qualified and trustworthy, being able to also access water, sanitation. You know, just one example, in Ethiopia at the moment, data shows that only 6% of the country have access to water in less than a 30-minute walk. And then we have urban settlements, like you can see in the illustration of the title of our session, which oftentimes, you know, they're informal, fast-growing, overcrowded, insecure, unsanitary, and often overlooked by public and private sectors. And all of us know also that the very strongest trend of this century is urbanization, and that will not end. You know, it's believed that 70% of Africa lives in informal settlements. In Ethiopia, for just one example, 80% of urban dwellers are in slums. So with these huge needs, we just really need to rapidly scale up and to find the very best solutions that can have an impact. So at the same time, we shouldn't dwell just on all the needs, although they're front and center in our mind. But the sector has a lot of economic opportunities, innovation opportunities. It can unlock green solutions. It can unlock jobs. We can think of digitalization. We can think of circular economy, of reducing waste. There's a huge potential just on the verge in Africa. One study that was done in 6 countries estimated that the housing and urban development construction sector had an influence between 7 and 14% of the national GDP. So that has a big place in the economies of Africa. And that's why I think our session today is so important. It's also a very critical time historically. At the moment, the EU and Africa are formalizing their partnerships, also with Africa, the Caribbean, and the Pacific, laying the lines of some agreements and understandings and priorities for the coming year. The EU is just right now in the middle of programming its funding decisions for the coming 7 years. And also, as we all know, we now have 10 years to reach the Sustainable Development Goals. So it's the right time for this session, and we really are happy to have a wonderful range of experts with us who can help us grapple with the issues of the day and give us recommendations. I want to put your attention today to one way of telling the story and bringing some of the best practices to the forefront. This is the Compendium of Best Practices of Housing in Africa. And so we're very happy to launch this publication of Habitat for Humanity today. And we will be posting the link for you so you can download it and read it at your leisure. And so this document provides insight in 6 particular areas that gives us the range of the different aspects of people's lives and of the SDGs that are affected by housing and urban renewal. And so it deals with the area of construction and materials and training and housing production, with the area of water, sanitation and hygiene, of housing finance, microcredit, another, of land tenure options, and slum upgrading, and then one chapter about integrated solutions and policy changes and partnerships. And so in this document, we have 19 cases. Fortunately, we couldn't cover all the wonderful experiences that are out there, but we're very grateful also for collaborations with Cities Alliance, UN Habitat, and Slum Dwellers International. On some of the cases, these cover 11 African countries. And for each case, beyond a little bit of context, there's the concrete activities, some of the effects and impact, and some lessons. So I do believe you'll find it interesting read, and I hope you'll download it soon. I think a few of the stories will be told today among our partners. And so now I want to right away jump into our dialogue and not hold it off too long. We have a great group of people here. The way this will function is our panelists will be presenting each of them, and then there'll be a little time for dialogue among the panelists, and then we will open it to questions from you. So do put your questions in the question and chat box if you want to direct them to a particular person. That would be great, and we'll make sure at that time that we have a little more dialogue with the audience, and hopefully more people will join us in the coming minutes. And then we'll have a little wrap up at the very end. So before I turn it over, I want to introduce briefly all our speakers. Of course, this is just a very brief introduction. So by the end of the session, we will facilitate for you a document with their more complete bios and all the wonderful experiences and background and knowledge of our speakers. That way you can get to know them a bit more, but we do want to be conscious of time and give more time to our speakers and to the debate today. So I'll go around and introduce them. Jane Otima, hello and welcome. She's the Associate Director of Market Systems and Entrepreneurship for Europe and Middle East and Africa with the Terwilliger Center for Innovation and Shelter of Habitat for Humanity International. And she's worked 20 years all around Africa in shelter, environment, business, and youth. So we're happy to welcome you. We also have Anaclaudia Rossbach. She's from Brazil. She's the Regional Manager of Latin America and Caribbean with Cities Alliance. And she's researched and given support and technical assistance in the housing and urban field for 20 years with a range of actors, the World Bank, local governments, national governments. And of course, she's worked in globally, Asia, Latin America, but has quite a few experiences in Africa, in South Africa, Mozambique, Angola, Egypt, and Namibia. So welcome, Anaclaudia. We also have Kecia Rust, who's joining us from South Africa. She's the Executive Director of the Center for Affordable Housing Finance in Africa, and she promotes affordable housing and affordable finance for the past 20 years, working with the public and the private sector. She's led research in topics such as affordable housing finance, property markets, sustainable human settlements, and has had a great background in all of that. So welcome, Kecia. We also have Johan Barr, who's a foreign policy expert and also knowledgeable in many other areas and in the work of global civil society. He's held positions with the German Federal Chancellery and the German Ministry of Foreign Affairs, but at the moment he leads the Hilti Foundation and their work on safe and affordable housing. They're pioneering technical solutions and testing innovations. So thank you, Johan, for joining us today. We have Umar Silla. Unfortunately, his video won't be working, but you will be hearing from him. He's the acting director for Africa for UN Habitat. We're very happy to have him. He has a wide long-term experience coordinating urban legislation, working with the legislation land governance branch, working with the GLTN unit. He advised land reform processes in many countries in Africa, and he coordinated land and property solutions for displaced people in the Great Lakes region. So thank you, Umar, for joining us. And we also have Lars Grunfeldt, who's joining us from Brussels with the European EU Commission. He is in the International Partnership, newly renamed Directorate General, and he leads the Urban Development section. And before that, he also had held posts in several EU delegations around the world. And one interesting one was working in the China delegation, overseeing as head of cooperation, where he was overseeing programs on urban development, low carbon development, employment creation, And he's also, previous to that, had other work in projects on municipal services, finance, and environmental regulation. So a wealth of experience and background. And so we welcome you, Lars. Thank you for joining us. And then we also have Jaime Royo-Olit, who's an Urban Development, Sustainable Transport, and Digitalization Senior Officer in the EU delegation to Kenya. He was previously with the EU in Cape Verde, Eritrea, and Sri Lanka, where they had also worked on some innovations, and he oversaw EU grants for over 12,000 households and their homes. And he's recently edited a book on lessons learned called Building, Owning, and Belonging. So welcome, Jaime. We're happy to have you with us. And now we'll move on to our speakers. And I want to give the floor first to Jane. And if you could help us understand some of the best practices and recommendation. Jane, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Caroline. It's a pleasure to be sharing our experience in this webinar, and I'll go right into the conversation because I think the challenge of housing is understood already by so many of us. And working with the Terwilliger Center for Innovation in Shelter, our approach has been to leverage the market, to leverage private sector in order to deliver on the housing dividend. So how do we do that? Next slide, please. We have been working in housing and market systems for a number of years as a program in Habitat. And really at the core of what we are doing is consolidating more than a decade of experience that we've had in developing market-based solutions and beginning to see how those could work in different contexts. We bring together different stakeholders, but we also begin to think of housing in a very different scope. How do we leverage housing to begin to address some social development challenges in the different contexts where we work? Next slide, please. Understanding that housing challenges are really complex and contextual, we have sought to apply different approaches in different countries. Of course, at the core of it is the key principles of market system development. I'll give you an example of work that we've done through our Liberia country program, a program that has been supported very strongly by the Cities Alliance. Now, Liberia is quite a challenging environment and context to work in, not because it's very thin economically, but there are also issues of war, etc. Now, how do we then go in and support the private sector to be able to innovate and bring to bear housing dividends? We went in to work through the financial inclusion sector, and we had to identify microfinance institution to work with and really build the capacity of that institution to be able to develop loan products that they could lend to the community. And this is the community in Peace Island, to be able to lend them to do various things that bring to bear the dividends of housing. So we worked both on the supply and the demand sides of housing. Now, the microfinance sector is quite thin in Liberia, and this was a daunting task, but we did manage. Now, one of the institutions we worked with has successfully managed to develop loan products that have targeted school upgrading, 36 private schools, that has targeted upgrading of 5 health facilities, and that has provided microloans for women as traders. Now, you might hear these results and wonder, what has that got to do with housing? This just goes back to underscore what Rick shared with us earlier, that in Habitat, we consider housing in a very holistic manner. We see housing as integrated, that if you have a decent house, you're able to actually achieve a wholesome life. So looking at how the loans have supported schooling, have supported health, and supporting enterprises to us begins to demonstrate the impact of housing, because we went in through a housing lens, but we've been able to support other developmental aspects. Now, we also have supported companies to be able to develop alternative building products. Now, we also understand that there's still a lot to be done around these alternative building products to bring them to a stage where they are acceptable to the entire community to be able to work with them. But we've worked with 3 companies, a company that has developed stabilized soil blocks. One has developed clay bricks using hydroforms. One has used recycled plastic to develop paving blocks. You can see from the photo there. We worked with a specialist who, this is a stress test. You might say, hey, she's too tiny. She's not strong enough to be able to test that this is really firm. But we also worked with the Ministry of Public Works in Liberia to actually take these products through a proper testing standards and stress tests before they were rolled out into the market. Now, the result of this for us as a program is very interesting, because in a place where housing was viewed as just concrete, brick and mortar, people are beginning to embrace the use of alternative building materials. Next slide, please. In looking at housing, we keep asking ourselves, how does housing work? How does the housing value chain look like? And we know for most of us, it ends at the wall, the floor, and the roof. But before we get to those core components of housing, there are issues around labor, around norms, around how do you even procure that material. And Caroline earlier said, sometimes we wish we had this platform that you could press and everything works. You have all the materials, you have all the labor. But we realize that if we do not address labor, and in linking housing to addressing some socioeconomic challenges, socio-development challenges in Africa, we realize that we can collaborate, and this is a program that's happening in Kenya. We can collaborate with the technical vocational training institutes to innovate different training models to ensure that we actually have quality and reliable labor in the market. So we've worked with these TVETs because as Terwilliger Center, we do not deliver programs directly. We support the private sector to do that. So they've come up with programs like TVET on Wheels. This is moving TVET out of the class into the space where the laborers already are working. We are looking at how to use digital platforms, and this is already happening. We have companies like iBuild and iSkills that we are working with who have portals that not just deploy labor, but they also deploy training to be able to reach the laborers who are not able to go back to school. But we are also working importantly with the public sector, because the regular way of training laborers in many African countries, and in Kenya for that matter, is for them to go to school before they get recognized. But we are working with the public sector to be able to tweak and adjust policies to begin to recognize prior learning for the laborers. And this is beginning to bear dividends in the country. Next, please. I talked of alternative building materials in Liberia. This seems to be a very common conversation and a very common intervention in most African countries. We are beginning to ask ourselves, how do we link housing actually to begin to address environmental challenges as well? So it's not just about ensuring that there are alternative building materials in the market, but beginning to actively think about housing as contributing to a sustainable environment. So in Kenya, we do actually have programs that are looking at how to recycle plastic and agricultural waste into construction materials. We are working with academia and government to make sure that these are tested and actually rolled out into the market. Next, please. We are looking at how we leverage youth into the housing sector. This is a conversation that's ongoing. There are sectors where young people think, oh, that's for old people, that's not good enough, that's not going to give me good money. And housing is one of them. We get young people mostly in the labor space, but through our programs and support from partners like Hilti, we've been able to start a shelter tech. We had a shelter tech accelerator, the first of its kind in this region. And what we found is that young people want to innovate housing products, but the investment that goes into making sure that those ideas mature and get to market are always lacking. So Through our Shelter Tech work, and specifically the Shelter Tech Accelerator in Kenya, we've seen young people innovate and begin to put different ideas and products into the market. This is a group of young people that have come up with an idea around co-living spaces that is beginning to be the go-to solution for young people looking for housing in the city of Nairobi. And it's one of those spaces we think that enabling young people to innovate, enabling them to move into the market, enabling them to bring solutions into the marketplace is actually something that we need to actively continue to support. Next, please. So thank you, and I look forward to continuing the conversation.
Thank you so much. Anaclaudia, do you want to continue with also some experiences and recommendations for Africa? The floor is yours. Oh, we can't hear you. If you could unmute yourself.
Sorry, yeah.
Yes.
Can you hear me well? Okay.
Yes,
thank you, Caroline. Thank you, Ricky, Jane, for the invitation, Habitat for Humanity. We are long-term partners. We have a long trajectory together working in many places. I think it's nice that we started this discussion talking directly about the problem, and Rick highlighted the major numbers and data information about informality at the global level. He mentioned 1 billion people living in slums. He mentioned 2 billion people working in informality. You, Caroline, you mentioned, and there's a report from the World Bank that says that 70% of the urban population in Africa is living in slums. There's also a recent paper from GIZ that mentions that 85% of the workforce is informal in Africa, and then 82% has no social protection. So it's very important that we start talking about partnerships, collaboration, and dialogue, understanding the focus where we need to act, especially after COVID, and expecting the hard impact of COVID for those populations, focus on precariousness, on vulnerability, on informality, and also, as Jane just shared, aiming for comprehensive and holistic intervention. So why do we want to collaborate? Where do we want to invest? We want to invest in the poor areas, in the vulnerable areas, and we want to invest in a comprehensive manner. So I think this is an excellent start for this discussion. I would like also to repeat Billy Cobbett, our director at Cities Alliance. He mentioned in a recent event that where we asked the major question, why are we still having this high prevalence of slums globally? We have been addressing this issue for many years, since it's structured through, development organizations, at least since the 70s. And we still have this high prevalence of slums and informality. So he said the main aspect, the main issue at the core is the political aspect. So it's a political matter, right? Because we already know how to do. All the organizations present in this debate, they know how to do. So I would like to highlight two assumptions based on that. One is that there is need for political shift, right? And then secondly, we need practical action and urgent. And practical action, how can we go for practical action? How can we scale up? So first of all, we need to have access to know-how, knowledge and information. And secondly, we have to amplify our implementation capacity. And this is where partnerships come. So we need to advocate together and collaborate for political shift. We need to promote exchange of information around practices and knowledge, to improve the access of information, to improve our know-how, and we need to collaborate in practical projects on the ground to amplify our implementation capacity. So I only have 1 minute left, so I just want to mention, and very briefly, one experience in Kenya that is very innovative right now and very relevant, because it can give us a light on how to change at scale. right? The Mukuru Special Planning Area, where 600,000 people live, it started years ago advocating for non-eviction, established partnership, very sophisticated and complex partnerships to improve the life of people living there. Then they started to advocate to change laws and regulations to generate improvements in this area. As a result of that, there is a new special law from 2017 that enable flexibilization of rules and standards in slums. And in 2017, this area was declared a special planning area, meaning that no matter the status of the land, infrastructure is able to come. So local governments, national governments are able to invest in infrastructure. This is already attracting the private sector and generating social benefits. Right now, people under COVID are improving access to water and improved sanitation, and certainly is attracting and will attract private investments in this area. So I need to close now, and maybe we can share more in the second round. Thank you.
Kecia, can you also add some of your best practices and recommendations?
Yes, thank you very much. Very good to be with you here today, and thank you so much for the opportunity. I wanted to show a couple pictures, actually. This one actually speaks to the points that Anaclaudia was just making. And it's an impossible to read slide. I'm sorry, but this is the UN Habitat statistics on the percentage of people living in slums. And you can see basically the orange bars are the most recent year, that's 2018 for each country. And significantly, it's pretty high. And so the number is a bit overwhelming. And that number, which is the SDG indicator 11.1, is the one that a lot of us spend a lot of time thinking about and fixating. But next slide, please. I think it's worth looking at the definition of slums as we think about that, because that then will help us be, as Anaclaudia said, practical about a targeted response to the actual issue we're dealing with. So there are 5 points that fall into the UN Habitat definition of slum housing, and it has to do with the durability of the unit itself, the size of it, so the sufficient living space, access to water and sanitation, and then security of tenure. So any housing situation in which any one of those issues are an issue would be classified as slum. Next slide, please. What we've done is, we've used here, this is data from the Demographic and Health Survey database, which is collected by USAID, and it's a really interesting and nuanced data set. And here is just a picture of 3 countries, and what we've done is selected the bottom 40th percentile of households living in urban areas. And just taking Cameroon as an example, 99%, like almost everyone, in the bottom 40th percentile in urban areas lives in potentially inadequate housing. But if we disaggregate that, 48% of those are in informal structures, 50% of those are in flush toilet, are in formal structures but with no flush toilet, and then 1% are in structures that are overcrowded. And so it is also in Nigeria and in Zambia, and we can look across the continent. If we start to think about our slum statistics in a disaggregated way, to look at what are the particularities of a person's housing condition, it might mean that we can apply different kind of measures in different contexts. So we can see that home improvements is a critical issue. Infrastructure investment is another critical issue. And then there's the issue of extensions, not to mention titling. But we don't have to think that the percentage of households living in slums is equivalent to the number of new houses that have to be delivered, given the breadth of that effort. We want a much more targeted response. Next slide, please. The thing that strikes us most when we think about, when we look at the practice of housing delivery across the continent and think about the way in which housing is actually delivered, well, the majority of it is built by households themselves. And I mean, this is a photograph I took. Behind me, when I took this photograph, behind me was a shiny, tall glass building. I was in the middle of Kampala. And what I'm so interested about with this photograph here is the house on the right. You can see that it looks like it's more or less formal construction. Certainly the one in the back looks like it was built by a formal developer. It's got quite a formal roof. The house on the left is looking a little bit, well, shoddy, I suppose. But the critical thing here is infrastructure. And I'm not certain about the title situation here. But there is a particular investment requirement here. And to recognize that, I think creates an opportunity for where we actually apply our efforts. One area which I think we should be talking about in this discussion is housing microfinance, and then also the linkage with municipalities and the role that they play in facilitating a more nuanced response. Next slide, please. This next picture that I'm going to show you is in Maputo, and this is an informal settlement in Maputo in Mozambique, and it's a very small group of builders who are building a unit on a plot. And again, that's the majority across the continent, where we've got small-scale micro builders who are developing. And they need a different kind of response than the large-scale developers that you would be that I think our policy imagines exist. So they need finance, and they need the right kind and appropriately structured. They need secure tenure and title of either sort, but they need that to be resolved and clear, because that's how they'll get finance. They need access to infrastructure, whether that's on or off grid, and there are a whole lot of innovation around that we can think about. Construction technical assistance, very critically, we need municipalities with the capacity to provide approvals on this small scale basis. And I strongly believe, and we can see it, scale will happen on this continent on a small scale basis. A colleague of mine calls it massive small, 1 + 1 + 1 + 1. And over that, with that, we have, you can use technology to enable that. We will achieve the scale we're looking for. And the next slide, please, which I think is my last one. So this is a photograph of a woman in Slovoville, which is a settlement that's on the edge of Soweto in Johannesburg. And South Africa, of course, has a government subsidized housing program that's built upwards of 4 million units over the last 25 years. But amazingly, even though the government has built so many units, and half of those are now on the deeds registry, but even in that context, we have the majority housing delivery in South Africa is the delivery of backyard units. And here there's a great opportunity for small scale landlordism. If you can click one more time, there's one more image to add on to this picture. Let's think about rental and think about the role that rental plays in cities and the significance it is not only for the tenants who are accessing accommodation, but also for the landlords, who many of whom are household, home-based landlords who are able to realize an income through this. And again, here's another intervention that I think is absolutely scalable. A backyard unit on the property of everybody who already has a property. And that starts to build a local economy and stimulates economic activity in that neighborhood. The majority of urban households across our continent are renters. And yet we don't have any policy framework. In very few countries do we have a policy framework that actually acknowledges their existence. We need to pay attention to that. And what is the financing that requires? And that will then also contribute to scale. And I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Kecia. Johan, can you join us and turn on your video? And we'd love to hear about some of your innovations and recommendations.
Thank you, Caroline. I would like to focus my short intervention on our work on housing products and technologies. It is our ambition at the Hilti Foundation to discover and promote technical innovation for safer and better homes for families in need. Let me take the example of our bamboo homes, which we developed in 2012 for a project in the Philippines. Together with our Hilti R&D centers and a team of engineers in the field, we set the objective to develop a housing technology that is disaster resistant, made from renewables, and comes at a cost below $5,000. I'm speaking of direct cost here. Over the following 5 years, we built more than 800 of these bamboo homes across the entire country. It withstood all major earthquakes and typhoons, and we also managed to set up a value and supply chain for treated bamboo as a construction material. This is what we considered a proof of concept at which we decided to join forces with larger partners like Habitat for Humanity to use the technology at an industrial scale. Building at scale, however, requires so much more than just the construction of homes. The availability of buildable land at a large scale, large funds to invest in construction, neighborhood development to meet the educational and healthcare needs of a new neighborhood, inclusion in wider urban planning schemes, etc., etc., etc. No organization will be capable of doing this just by itself. For our largest project, we therefore formed a coalition of partners from local and international NGOs, local and higher level government and administration, microfinance organizations, local companies, as well as multinationals, among others, Hilti, and united all of them under one targeted approach to create a visible example of change in a large-scale field project, what is to become an ecosystem for sustainable bamboo construction. Why am I sharing this? Because we know at the Hilti Foundation that a housing technology like the projects that we support, a technology alone will not be sufficient to drive sustainable social change at a large scale. We need to integrate our housing products and technologies, as well as our corporate expertise, into the work of others who drive social change, including health, education, employment, to make this holistic change that Anaclaudia and Jane were speaking about earlier. So for the sake of time, I would like to make 3 quick conclusions. And again, I'm repeating what Anaclaudia said. We need practical action, especially for large-scale field projects. We are convinced it needs targeted collaboration, well-managed coalitions that are aligned on expected project outcomes, a management structure, and a similar working culture. These coalitions are difficult to lead and to manage. We therefore started a project only last year with Habitat for Humanity to test and evaluate on 10 practical cases what it requires to make such coalitions succeed in the housing sector in a very practical manner. Second, small foundations, small private foundations have a unique position to take calculated risk in testing new and innovative approaches before they go to scale, whereas scale approaches obviously go beyond our capacities most of the time. And lastly, corporate foundations understand how corporations work, and I believe, therefore, we are the unique entrance point to engage the business world in social change on a level that goes beyond the mere provision of funds. And I'm happy to share a little bit later what it means for us at Hilti to engage our corporate expertise, for example, in the work that Jane described. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Umar. Thank you so much, Johan. Very interesting developments. And at this point, we will bring on Umar that we have with no video but sound. And very much looking forward to your intervention. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Caroline. You hear me?
Yes, thank you.
Yeah, I'm very delighted to be part of this panel and realize how much diversity we have to this panel. And one colleague was talking about partnership. I was just dreaming getting all these people together around a program to scale up all these experience we are talking about, just to demonstrate, how powerful is partnership. I know Rick has set the scene on talking all these challenges we are facing urbanization in Africa. But the whole question, on my perspective, is really how to turn those, challenges into opportunity. because you talk about, million of person in informal settlement, million of person in cities, secondary cities, intermediate cities now in Africa. And we have as well this huge housing deficit in Africa, which is 60 million. At the end of the day, I think we are talking about, a market of billion people. And getting housing in the center of these billion people as a business model, what does it look like, I think, for Africa? I think those are some questions we should ask ourselves. Of course, also today, we miss a lot of opportunity if we're not tapping, the value of housing to address this economic and social dynamic, even now environmental dynamic. One example, I think, has been mentioned by the first presentation on the job creation, where we have a huge, population of youth in Africa looking for jobs. And we see this housing sector as an opportunity to establish a value chain of producing material, construction material, but also training skills and others. And unfortunately, today, we see the disparate, situation of youth and even being engaged on the extremism in Africa and others, political complaint. From there, they don't feel really comfortable. But also another gain we are missing now, the taxation element. Today, we see municipalities, local government, how much they are getting from their own revenue. And they could have tapped on this value of housing, to really inform basic services process and infrastructure. I think those, without counting now the social inclusion, I think those are some elements we need to look at in terms of opportunity and what needs to be done for that. I think my colleague from City Alliance has talked about policy. On the UN Habitat side, we believe that policy direction is very important because you cannot deal with this housing sector without clear direction and also having an integrated approach to the matter. Because what we see as a policy up to now, they are really sectorial and not addressing also all stream that we need to have in the right place to be able to promote this housing sector as a driver for economic transformation. And one element I would like to touch base is the issue of land. I think I've been working on this sector all my life. And I see still, this attitude of shyness in Africa of touching this land issue because we see it is very sensitive for now. And today we see the blockage we are facing in terms of promoting investment, but also of even protecting some specific rights, indigenous rights, women's land rights, and others. And today, still, we are in a very old fashion of dealing with our land administration system, our cadastral system. And today we still have only 30% of this coverage of the system where we are talking about digitalization system, where we are talking about smart city, which is for me a dream, because unless we address those matters, we cannot talk about smart city, where citizens cannot access to land information system and cannot protect their land right. But at the same time, what we are missing on the issue of land is the element of financing. Because even this land could have served the purpose of financing this housing sector. And we have a lot of instruments on the land-based financing, from this taxation system to land value capture that we can really need to develop in Africa to make sure municipality, local government understand very well, the dynamic of land value capture and what does it mean, especially in the current context where many cities and countries are going into deep, investment of infrastructure like Nairobi and other big cities. I think there's opportunity to explore on this particular area. The second point for me on the policy aspect, the financing, I think you touched base on that at the beginning, Caroline. Even from your study, you demonstrate that 97 to 90% of people has no access to formal financing. How we can promote, if you want to land housing market under those conditions, where we have a lot of informality, but also a lot of people, especially low-income people, does not have access to financing and to any model we are talking about. Today in Africa, the interest rate in many banks is still high. Even high-level function, civil servant cannot afford it. You imagine now those living in the informal settlement. And I think that's a particular juncture. I think we need to explore innovative partnership. How we can bring private sector is very fundamental, because I believe the role of the government is not really covering the whole need on finance or housing. The role of the government is establishing policy, is establishing enabling environment for private sector and others initiative to come in. And from there, we need to have what we call this fiscal measure and incentive and every kind of subsidy we can expect from the government, or it will be difficult. Policy is important, even talk about regulatory framework. And today, I think with this challenge of COVID-19, I think there's a lot we need to retrofit and to make sure we are capturing the new dynamic within which we are navigating in the current urban sector. I think those are some necessary. On some best practices for UN Habitat, of course, You have been working with UN Habitat for a long time. I think a lot has been done through UN Habitat, but I just want to bring 3 elements on our work. One, it is our work on context of climate change. And I think so we have been working in Mozambique in the context of cyclone, where we have been giving technical assistance to the government to ensure resilience and sustainable building code, but also integrate sustainable criteria to the formulation of urban development plan, because that is another context. Because if you look at the context of Mozambique, which has been disparate some time, every year is being wiped by a cyclone and we come and rebuild. And same cases for post-conflict context as well. What kind of approach do we need on that? I think we need to rethink our approach on those particular contexts. The second best practices is more about the slum upgrading program. You all know we are working on that with European Union for 10 years now, and this program has yielded good outcome in terms of mobilizing community, but of engaging as well central government and local government, because they are all contributing to this process, because they are all confronted to this issue of informal settlement, which is quite very important, dynamic in terms of policy development and implementation, because you need to link local and national level in a way that we are addressing this issue of informal settlement, also looking into upscale. And lastly, maybe in terms of best practices that I would like to throw on the floor, this concept of owner-driven housing. I think Habitat for Humanity have been working with UN Habitat on that in Sri Lanka. I think what are those best practices we can scale up and bring in Africa and look into context? Because of course it's not fit for purpose for all, but we can look at what are the necessity and the requirement for those experience to scale up in Africa. I think those are elements of reflection for me. On the policy side, looking the financial dimension to the land dimension, but also what are the best practices that we can use to influence policy and others, scaling process that we are talking about on this discussion. Thank you very much, Caroline.
Thank you so much, Umar. And now, Lars, we'd like to pass the floor to you. Thank you. We don't hear you. Are you muted?
I'm unmuted now.
Yeah.
Thanks a lot for this, and then we very much appreciate to attend this conference or event. I think it's extremely topical and try to bring the urban agenda forward and the housing here. The compendium that you have brought out just to reflect very much our thinking on the same subject, and I think we very much appreciate the set of conclusion that we have to work on the housing supply technology, the financing, the security tenure, the policy framework, and I think the underlying message is that we can actually not work on these individual elements, but they all have to contribute together to give a integrated reply and integrated response. So this is very much aligned with us. So I would like to try to take a little bit different perspective here and argue or explain how can maybe our type of support be used to bring scale. That means our development assistance obviously cannot create change alone, but contribute to actors can enact change and bring scale to this here. We have supported through our development cooperation, for example, as mentioned before, the participatory slum upgrading program, which in many countries create conditions for doing, conditions for changing, conditions for finding new technologies, conditions for engaging, but we sit with the same challenge: how do we bring this here to scale, and reflection on that. First of all, I think what this here brings out, and also what the compendium stresses, is that housing is central for the wider development picture. It comes out and share how it's linked to the creating jobs, green transformation, digital transformation, creating livelihoods. And I think this is very well put out, and this is also where we see this is our, what can we say, priorities for taking forward. One could say, should a donor go in this, like EU, we could just say this is so clear, so let's articulate urban development is a key priority. However, the way this the EU is articulating this, then we are defined what we want to achieve our high-level goals are as exactly the green transition, the digital, etc. And on top of that, also very much dealing with inequality. And I think there we sit with that the housing, the urban development is the center of this here, and we will never achieve to deal with inequality unless one find adequate solutions to the housing and which is just expanding in issues and challenges. So I think this would be the first thing, I think, out of such a project, a message back to donors and to us, it would very much be that to actually deal with inequality, to deal with the challenges we see as there, dealing with informal housing, finding adequate solution is central. I think this could be a contribution to that debate. Secondly, how we see this taking forward and bringing scales. As I said, we made many projects where we support methodologies. Also, we have CSO programs that have tested different examples. We also have from China supported the bamboo generation. We have supported things as trying to unblock constraints in value chains. And we have various programs at national level that try to put in housing as is. If you look to the future, there we will increasingly try to allocate our funds around national intervention. And that means to create this momentum for this, we have to engage at the national level. These global programs where we in some way say, let's overall support a very good idea and then try to roll it out, will be much less focused. So a second message is, if you are to take this forward, those actors that are dealing with it will have to engage at the national level. And in several of these countries, if you look across Africa, across that, we have seen many of our delegation in discussion with delegation will take urban development forward. And this means this will be the basis for trying to work on integrated programs of dealing with how can the urban areas be changed, how to work with policy, how to work with financing, how to work with capacity building and methods. So there's a need for taking this debate and these conclusions at the national level, and also our EU delegation that are looking at this would be happy to engage in such debates and see how can this actually fit into our national programs with this. The third element in our future programming and future invention is that there'll be increasingly focus on financing instruments. That means we are using what we call both blending. That means in trying to mix grants with lending to make it more feasible, and with guarantees, where we try to provide guarantees through banks that can attract investments. And let me see briefly how these two could link to our agenda here, to actually unblock and promote investments in housing. Very important thing, as also has been demonstrated, is to have the supportive infrastructure that makes it more attractive to bring in investment in housing. This obviously is investment heavy, often difficult to finance, and there one could bring in such as blended finance, having on the one hand a financing on this here, but also to adjust or improve financial viability, combine that with grants. What on the other element, on the guarantees, this is the idea to attract more private finance by providing such guarantees. This is not straightforward how that can be done, but for example, here with housing, the idea to have funds that support or lends or put equity into microfinance institution that could underpin such investments in urban, there a guarantee could be used from an IFI or an international finance institution to take on a part of the risk in such a fund. That means if there is a fund that invests in a microfinance institution, then the fund could, their EU guarantee could be used to take the first loss, and that means make it less risky to invest in these funds, could be used to mobilize funds for investment in financing schemes. This is it's not something we will design. This is something that will require that the financing institutions, the actors, the microfinance institutions, some way create some partnerships around that. But this is something we would see as a feasible way forward, but requires that partners are working together in partnerships, which I think is a recurring elements in this discussion here. And so these three elements, in some way, coming back and saying, demonstrating out of this exercise the importance of the housing. I think we are in a group where we're all convinced, but it's well to send that signal again that this is central for the development agenda. Secondly, working with the countries and engaging on that level. And lastly, see how we can find jointly innovative ways to support the finance. And I think these are elements where the EU development assistance or development cooperation could be used to leverage this here and bring it to scale. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Lars. Jaime, we'd like to pass you the floor and also hear some of your practical recommendations. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Caroline. Let me see if I can do justice to all the very insightful ideas that have been presented. I'm going to try to talk about what is the potential best practices that we are aiming at establishing here with the government of Kenya in Kenya. So I'm based here in Nairobi. Please, next slide. So the EU hasn't been working in affordable housing in Kenya just as yet. And one of the main donors has been the World Bank. So we have been in close collaboration with them to understand what are the most innovative and effective potential mechanisms to unlock supply for developers in urban areas. And there's a very promising partnership in the making where we intend to collaborate with the government, where the government puts land as equity, and we create an SPV, special purpose vehicle, with different local investors with a vested interest in providing rental housing for their workers, can join in a venture to develop affordable housing. And we are working very closely with the European Investment Bank. The idea here, of course, is addressing people who can get some level of debt, what we call the mortgage gap, and try to bring the cost of this housing units to the most affordable possible levels. Next slide, please. However, as we can see from the work from Kecia, from the Center for Affordable Housing Finance, the average low-cost house in Kenya would be of $25,000, and only 12% of the population can afford it. So how can we address the needs of those who cannot afford so much? So we go to the next slide. So the first thing to accept and realize is that the private sector and the public sector, even putting efforts together, don't even deliver as much as people themselves do through the informal sector, which also involves the private but informal sector. In the case of Kenya, about 65% of houses are being provided through owner-driven processes and through incremental housing. So is there any hope for the public and the private sector to match that production, or maybe is there another approach? So we'll discuss this a little later. So next slide. So to address the needs of people who don't have access to the necessary finance, we are partnering with a coalition of UN agencies on 3 pillars. The pillar number 1, as Omar mentioned, is the issue of land management. And here there is a big movement, big effort by the government of Kenya to digitalize land registries. And it's very important that this is done in a transparent manner, in a manner that we prevent the digitalization of corruption and so forth. So we want to work with FAO, UNODC, and the Global Land Pool Network best practices. Next slide, please. The pillar 2 is building on this 10 years of participatory slum upgrading program. Next slide, because there's another image in this one, where the European Commission has been supporting UN Habitat in preparing these community action plans to be implemented. So we want to take it to another level. I'm very pleased to inform the European Investment Bank has earmarked more than 50 million euros loan for this purpose, and we are waiting to get green line from the European Commission to start implementing many of these actions. Next slide, pillar 3. The pillar 3 is about trying to create the conditions for this incremental housing to take place, which is the only approach which is delivering to scale. And when I'm talking to scale, I'm talking about millions. So this is what I want to focus on as a key message. If we go through the next slides relatively swiftly, we could just go with a rhythm. Basically, as Umar mentioned, this EU-UN Habitat partnership in Sri Lanka, where can you go to the next slide? I can see it. The EU delegation delivered more than 20,000 houses, which are owner-led. Next slide, please. In response to the war. And the key message here, next, so we can see the message here, is that for the last 60 years, the key is where we are assisting people instead of substituting people. So when talking about finance, we're talking about people, we're talking about policy. The important thing is how can we capitalize on the efforts of people. So this next slide, please keep going slide after slide every few seconds. This is the type of households that we see. And here you see an evolution of housing costs that are below 100 excuse me. which I believe $100 per square meter. So with a subsidy of $5,000 we're able to deliver 70 square meter house. This is in 2011, and we'll see how this evolves over the years with inflation, but we remain in the scope of between 4,000 and 7,000 US dollars for 55 to 60 square meter houses. Again, always staying under the magic figure of $100 US per square meter. So here we see examples with UN Habitat, Australian Aid. This is with Habitat for Humanity, building with locally sourced materials like earth concrete blocks. Next slide. And I wanted to make sure we show these slides because if you don't see it, you wouldn't really believe it, that you could build this beautiful bioclimatic, low cost and locally sourced houses for so little. So the question is about building the local technology, local supply chains with compressed stabilized earth blocks in Sri Lanka. So how do we build an industry to ensure that there's the supply chains working in favor of the supply? Go to the next slide, please. That's kind of sad. And this is probably the apex. These houses are the apex of my career, I would say, in achieving the supply of housing, where we have this compressed stabilized earth block incremental houses that allow for future expansion. And again, we remain under 7,000 US dollars for 55 square meter house. Next slide. So the question of the reason why I'm showing these houses, you can go to the next one, is that we in South Asia, and there's the case of India, they've realized this already 70 years ago, that working with the people and using their incentives to deliver is the only way to deliver houses in the millions. So in the rural program for housing delivery, they are delivering 30 million houses in 5 years through this owner-driven approach. And out of the 20 million urban context, is close to about 5 million also through the owner-driven approach. Next slide, please. And in the case of India, it's sufficient with a 2,500 USD subsidy for a 25 square meter house. And the last slide that you will see is that this is in the order of magnitude between 4 to 10 times less than most of the market prices of the low-cost houses in Africa, as illustrated by the Center for Affordable Housing Finance Kecia is leading. So the question I want to bring here to challenge everybody, isn't there something that we ought to learn from South Asia in terms of how to deliver for much less? And the very, very final last message in the last slide is that we should be thinking not only in terms of financing, but also, as you can see here, what is not necessarily financial. What are the in-kind contributions that people can put, that communities can contribute? Some people call it sweat equity. The government can contribute land. We have community land trusts, etc. So what is it beyond what is financial that we can do to ensure that it is productive? Not only that we're thinking about the interest of investors and de-risking investors, but actually helping people's inputs and production. That's it from my side, and all this can be found in a book called Building, Owning and Belonging, which is free to download from the European Publications Office. Thank you, and over to you.
Thank you so much. I want to invite all our panelists to turn on your videos and join us again. We are a little bit over on time. Hopefully our participants can stay longer with us because this is a really exciting group of people and such interesting stories. So I want to ask you a few questions, and I'll ask all our panelists to stay quite brief in your interventions on this round, and then we do have a few questions from the audience that we want to get to. So Jane, you were mentioning, of course, some really interesting ways to work with the bottom of the pyramid. I'm wondering if you can say a little bit more of some of your recommendations. How can we unlock investment? How can we overcome some of the barriers in that?
Thanks, Caroline. I think part of that has been shared by my fellow panelists like Jaime and Kecia. But I do see that if we are to unlock investment in this sector, and especially to unlock investments around innovation, that we have to think comprehensively about housing. It's not just the structure. It's the whole housing value chain. It's about the financing, yes, but it's the materials. It's the social norms around it. It's how people understand and build their homes. It's housing that's not necessarily formal developer-led. It is what Jaime is correctly saying we call owner-driven construction in this country. It's about building capacity of investors to be able to bundle and unbundle their resources to invest in the young people and the innovations that are beginning to come up in the ecosystem. So it's around just stepping out of the box that we might have locked ourselves into and looking at how we can begin to deliver housing very comprehensively. And it's also about in Africa understanding that there are houses and homes in Africa in some countries, and those two things mean very different scopes for people in different countries. So it's really understanding the nuances and the norms around it, and that might lead us to beginning to move the needle, really. Thank you.
Yeah, so picking up on that, Anaclaudia, you also had several interesting examples that would be wonderful to hear a lot more details on. But talk to me a little bit, how can we get the dialogue going? How can we get maybe some South-South collaboration or bring out more of these best practices to really move forward at scale in the future?
Sure, and our previous speakers already gave some examples. Jaime was just mentioning the RAY and the PMAY program in India. Citizen Alliance has support with the World Bank has supported for many years India-Brazil exchange on human settlements and housing. So I was part of that, and I witnessed when RAY was designed, when PMAY was designed. So lots of these programs, they have some touches from experiences both in South Africa and in Brazil. The same goes for South Africa. We are now working with a community of practice. Kecia is part of that, CAF is part of that, but we do have representations from local governments, from national entities. We are looking at, why after so many years, South Africa was not able to scale up slum upgrading, right? Trying to understand what happened, especially now after the impact of COVID, it's so visible, right? How these poor communities are suffering, and the perspectives are not so good. So we have been discussing among this group of people, looking inside, but also looking at outside. So looking at experiences, especially from Latin America and the exchanges that we organized last year. So how cities like Bogota, Belo Horizonte, Buenos Aires, have been addressing not only COVID, but also historically the challenge of slums, urban slums. I'm talking now here about urban slums, aspects such as density, such as access to infrastructure, resettlement, governance, community participation, project design, land value capture. So there is a lot. I'm completely in agreement with you, Jaime. There's a lot that we can learn. And now with internet and everything, and Zoom and go to webinars, we have a wonderful possibility to connect and to exchange practical knowledge that's not written out there. We have less information about what we have been doing lately.
Thank you, Kecia. The statistics you provided, and also, of course, the books you worked on are just so very helpful. Can you maybe give us some ideas of how we can move forward using evidence and sharing evidence among all these actors?
Yeah, thank you. We say that data and market information is our business. And yet it's so hard to gather. There is so little data available, and we pull it from every source as much as we can, and we stretch it and to try and tell a story. And I think what was so exciting about Jaime's presentation was that there it was. We saw the evidence in the photographs together with the numbers that these things are possible. So we really need that. So we're involved in an initiative right now, which has been championed by FSD Africa Investments and FSD Kenya, to promote a notion of open source in the housing sector, in the affordable housing sector. And we're just starting it, but I would really love, I can't not say it, because I would really love you to join and to engage with us, because I really think that we can make it work. So as DFIs, and Lars, the issues that you raised in terms of the objectives and the principles in terms of the finance framework are so critical. But none of that investment can happen if there isn't data, if there isn't information, because the investor has no basis on which to make a decision. We can't get that data unless actually we all start to share it, because it just gets locked up in the delivery processes. So the intention is to say where public money is invested, the quid pro quo for that investment is that the data that arises from the development that money has funded becomes available to share. Now that's sort of scary for some developers because they think that there will be commercial problems with that. So what we need is an assembly and a verification process that makes it possible for that data to be shared safely in a market development way. And we really want to do that. The things, say very quickly, the things that we think are specifically we want to get from each development are, we want to understand the product, the costing of the product all the way down to brick level. And that tells us a lot about the construction value chains. We want to understand the process. So that's very much like doing business indicators or what DeSoto did years ago. It's steps, time, and cost. And what's the difference between what's legislated and what actually happens in real life? Because often they're streets apart. Then we want to understand the people. We really need to understand the demand side. Do you know that across this continent, we don't know what affordable housing means. Everybody is asking what's affordable housing, and yet we use the word all the time. And that's because we don't have data on the demand side. And that data gets created through the development process, because that's when developers are engaging with the demand side. So we need that. And then we need data on performance. Is it working? Are we achieving the things we're expecting? Are we achieving the environmental and the green objectives that we're trying to achieve? The job creation, how do we integrate the formal and informal sectors in the housing delivery process? So I would really like to challenge this whole audience and whoever else watches it later to join in this, because I think there's a great opportunity. And we need the capacity to then beneficiate, turn that data into something useful. And that's something that we're very keen to work on.
Thank you. And that's a passionate call. I hope all of us heed to that call in the future. Johan, I just wanted to see if you wanted to give maybe one practical tip about how partnerships can develop a little bit better, especially with the private sector. How can we bring the private sector to the table? And we can't hear you. Sorry. Is your mute on? Johan, I think you're muted.
Yeah, I think now you can hear me. Oh,
yes,
perfect. I wanted to support Kecia's point about data, and I feel it's not only important for public investments that we make sure data is shared, but also for private donor organizations like the Hilti Foundation, that we make sure our partner organizations share that data, because it's important for us that in the end we have evidence-based projects that achieve impact, and it's not exclusive to one organization what we learn and what we share. But let me get to your point, Caroline. I think for private sector engagement, it's important to see private business not only as a source of funding, and we get a lot of requests how Hilti as a corporation can get access to financing certain projects. For us, the gateway into a business corporation is to find the right people within the business context, to make them understand what is needed in terms of direct support. How can we employ the experts that we have within Hilti to help startups or young businesses improve their business models? How can we open our testing centers for startups to help them test their technologies to make them better and safer? How can we help develop value chains? And I believe there is so much expertise in private corporations and multinationals that this will create a direct link and a way to also make people think more about what development actually means. And we do work with Habitat for Humanity on employing our staff globally on actively getting engaged in these programs, like, for example, providing mentors for startups in the shelter tech accelerators that Jane mentioned. Thanks.
Thank you. Umar, I wanted to bring you in. You know, several people have talked about the importance of policy and how do we make sure policy actually gets implemented. So from that perspective, talk to us also, how can we unlock better partnerships?
Can you hear me, Caroline?
Yes, thank you.
Yes. I mean, I really like the way that Kecia has framing, you know, her response. I think she responded already even to the question you asked to me, because look at the challenge we are facing on the data sectors. Even now, informing policy or making pitch, you know, of the African Union is very difficult of getting those data in the housing sector and urban sector. That's something, even today, we have to inform the SDGs 11 and others, but still. And I believe this coalition is very important, you know, getting together, looking to cross-sectorial, intersectorial, and integrated approach. From there, we can get together and inform those programs. And some particular example, for example, in IMOA, there's something emerging because we are working with World Bank and the IMOA, West, you know, Monetary Union of West Africa, to establish the Center of Excellencies today. And what is unique on that is a form of partnership we managed to develop. We are cooperating with this regional body, REX, but also the World Bank, but at the same time building capacity at the national level for institution, university, and academic system to be part of this Center of Excellence. And we are collecting a lot of data in terms of urban profiling in different, you know, countries in this 11, you know, in this region. But at the same time, how we can use this data. I think what is important in this partnership as well, how to link the global and with the local. It's very important because you don't want to see a partnership where we have only international institutions getting together and forgetting to do the liaison with local government. And on that, one other example, I'm very proud of it. Habitat for Humanity has contributed to that, is the Global Land Tool Network, which is bringing together 80 partners, globally speaking, developing knowledge. And we see the stride we are making now on the land administration system, because every country in Africa, most of them now are regularizing customary system, are developing a fit-for-purpose land administration system, but also are benefiting from those tools have been developed by this collective action. The last one I want to mention, the one that Amy mentioned in Kenya that we are working on developing this tripartite partnership, government, United Nations, donors, and international financial institution, because at the end of the day, ownership is very important from government side. If they don't own it, very difficult, especially take into consideration all this complexity we mentioned during this discussion to get on board this politician. And you talk about policy. So when is policy, our role as an international institution is building capacity and supporting monitoring system for those government to be able to be accountable of that. I think those are some model of partnership we see. I'm sure, as you mentioned, Caroline, at the beginning, there's a lot we can do with this group, you know, to advance and scale up those best practices. Over to you. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, that's very helpful insights. Jaime, coming back to you, it's been exciting to see how, as a EU delegation officer, you've gotten your hands in the mud of all these innovations, this data collection, etc. Can you give some recommendations to your colleagues around Africa and other delegations? For some of them, it might be maybe an area that is daunting, and we know from what Lars said, now it's all about negotiations at the national level. What could you add to that?
Yeah, no, I could myself. Yeah. Thank you. Well, that's a challenge to recommend to. I think my colleagues in EU delegations are, I'm sure, very, very busy, and it's taken a lot of push to transition from a traditional focus on rural development and budget support to include housing in the agenda. And if it wasn't for people like Lars and a few other champions in headquarters, it'd be quite difficult for some reason. So I can only say that housing touches upon everything. So I think it's a certain bet. If you bet on housing, you are sure you are delivering something constructive, unless you make the big mistakes that are quite well known. giving a free house to people without their participation is known to be a key for failure. There needs to be participation. There needs to be a level of subsidy. Therefore, the EU delegations are in a privileged position because we work with subsidies, and we are probably one of the largest donors in terms of the amount of subsidy component that we deliver. And the subsidy is essential if we want to reach to the poor. So I want to tell people that we have to work with markets. We need to work with the private sector. The private sector has many forms, but affordable housing for the bottom of the pyramid requires some form of subsidy. So the question is, how do we optimize the use of that subsidy to make the best out of it, to make the investment productive? And therefore, blending, which is one of the big buzzwords, is offering a big opportunity here. And it has been really amazing to work with colleagues in the European Investment Bank who have had this appetite to work in affordable housing for some time, for quite a few years, and suddenly now they really see an opportunity to scale up, because now some of this data, such as the one that the Kecia is producing, is allowing to see that these smart subsidies that involve the contributions of people through incremental growth, through sweat equity, etc., which are very difficult to account. Well, those things happen to be so large and so potentially important that there's no way any other approach, which is exclusively market-led or investor-led, is going to be able to mobilize it. So that kind of hint in terms of data, because there's a lot more data to be developed there, it's available out there. Therefore, I would encourage my colleagues in the EU delegations to reach out to UN Habitat, Habitat for Humanity, Renewal, the Center for Affordable Housing Finance, and other Cities Alliance who have the knowledge, because I think for the last 70 years we've known what has to be done, but somehow we are not doing it. And it's a matter of building on those best practices that are known, and we just have to innovate in terms of the financial partnerships, financing partnerships that now I think we are more, let's say, prone to engaging with. And now it's easier to conceive subsidies with loans that a few years back were kind of in opposing camps. So I think it's an exciting field, and I will extend my assistance to the extent possible to replicate what we're trying to do here in Kenya, which I hope will deliver houses at an affordable rate. Over. I'm not sure how it's put.
Lars, yeah, you spoke about how this aligns with EU priorities, but we do know right now there's so many things that EU is already contributing on. There's huge investments needed in economic development, and because of COVID. So can you maybe tell us a little bit how we can ensure that the investment can reach the scale that is needed? How can we unlock more investment? If you can unmute yourself, please. We don't hear you.
Good idea, sorry. And how to bring scale and also implementation to this, I think it links very much up to what Jaime was saying, an example he was giving from Kenya. Part of the how to bring things forward, we have long worked on exactly programs on supporting with the technical assistance, capacity building, but the possibility to link the financing and the subsidies and the grants often provides an incentive for moving forward and maybe overcoming things that are difficult to take forward or reforms. It's obviously, we've seen historically that many of the changes that we try to achieve in the sector run around or go around on political constraints or not taken forward. And that means partly by linking these things, I think this we see as an opportunity for trying to bring both the scale investments and also the supporting reforms into this, and in that sense move it forward. At the same time, I think we also support and will support such things as experimentation and moving things forward, but this is often on a much smaller scale and will not bring the scale we want. And there we see, as I said, the centrality of these financing instruments. Oh.
Thank you so much. So we do have a few interesting questions from the floor, and we'll try to see if maybe we could get a couple respondents on each one. I wanted to start with one question that's quite specific on microfinance. We have a question from Tun Kazuga about, can you share some thoughts on microfinance for rental housing? That's a challenge. So is there a way to support income generation for more vulnerable groups? Is this realistic? Is it a distraction? So maybe Kecia and Jane, if you could jump in a little bit about how microfinance can be expanded.
I'd love to answer that question. It's not at all a distraction. It's where we should be looking. People need rental accommodation. It's a function of household mobility and labor mobility. It's going to support the growth of economies so people can go and live close to where they work. It's critical. And at the same time, it is an amazing income earning opportunity for the landlord. And I really think we need to think quite carefully about household landlordism as a serious option, because there you've got a direct relationship between landlord and tenant. So the management is much more secure and manageable, and you're creating an income stream for a household. To link that with housing microfinance is an excellent opportunity, because the thing that microfinance has struggled with for the longest time is that microfinance is pretty good with small SME finance, enterprise lending, because it relies on an income stream to be produced out of the thing that the money is being invested into, the business that the money is invested into. And housing has always been a little bit scary because it is perceived by the financial sector as a consumption good, not as a productive good. And what rental does is it turns housing into a productive good. And it means if you think about your housing microloan as an SME loan that's going into a house, it's kind of like a win-win. You've got, and you're turning, the other thing you do too is you're turning your demand side into a supplier. And so we're really building the capacity of housing supply by targeting finance particularly into what's needed. Now that microloan will be bigger than your classic SME microloan because housing is expensive to build, but it can be built incrementally as well. And Habitat has all that experience about how do you phase the delivery process, and phasing it with finance, recognizing that rental is happening anyway. It's there. So it should be financed, and that will make it much more efficient.
Jane, do you want to add something about the microfinance area and some research you have?
Indeed, and I do agree with Kecia, and I would like us to point us back to an approach that we use in Habitat for housing. We view delivery of housing through an ecosystem approach. So we work right from the household to community levels to market and policy levels. Now, if we have to support vulnerable groups to use microfinance as an income generation strategy through rental, then we have to ensure that at household level, their capacities are actually built for them to be able to access this microfinance in the first place. If you look at our example in Liberia, where we worked with the microfinance institution, yes, but the loans ended up supporting vegetable growing at household level. Why? So that those households can actually be able to access the microfinance. So it's several things. You can't go in with a straight jacket. You have actually to analyze. You have to do the assessments and ensure that at household level, it does make sense. And when we go into group enterprises, you have to ensure that we are working with partners who can support that, moving it to community level, and that incremental growth for the vulnerable groups, enabling them to actually be able to generate income out of the venture that they are getting themselves into. And by the time they are linked to formal microfinance institutions, they need to have that strong basis. And that's why we advocate for this ecosystem approach to housing in Habitat.
Interesting. Yeah. And also, I think some of the work in the compendium is about building the capacity of the microfinance institutions so that they can provide these loan products so that they can do the market analysis, the research that comes afterwards with how the money was invested, how it can come incrementally, etc. Very interesting developments. Another aspect that is very common in urban settings today in Africa, but also around the world, you mentioned, Anaclaudia, the possibility of co-housing or co-living spaces. So there's a question from the audience from Dominika Hucienska, if co-living spaces can improve the life of people in slums. Would you recommend them as an approach residing in redesigning slum areas? So about different types of models of housing. What are your thoughts on that?
I think this is a question should be made to slum dwellers themselves. It might be a good approach depending on the culture, on the situation, on each context, right? What I would recommend as an approach is maybe can be translated through a decalogue on slum upgrading. I put the link to the decalogue here in the chat. Rachel, I'm not sure if this can be shared with the whole audience, but with UN Habitat, Habitat for Humanity, the Urban Housing Practitioners Hub, a series of entities in Latin America, we have built this decalogue together, and it brings some key elements of we believe are fundamental to be taken into account when we go for slum upgrading. So basically, in situ, recognize political recognition of the social function of the land, the rights of the slum dwellers to stay where they are, to get improvements where they are, to have access to the city, to the city's opportunities, to go comprehensive, to respect the memories and the culture, to work on the software, on the socio-economic development. So this is actually the expected ideal, of course, approach towards slum upgrading. But the answers are different because they will depend on the different communities' wishes, desires, visions, and possibilities in each community, in each city, in each country.
Thank you. So we do have limited time. We're going over just a little bit, but I wanted to slip in hopefully maybe one or two other questions. Umar, I hope if you can still be with us. We have a question from Julian Baskin at Cities Alliance. The elephant in the room in Africa, of course, is that it's only 2% of the world trade, and governments need wealth tax to invest in infrastructure. Because of course urban development has to do not just with the houses, but the whole set of infrastructure and services. So, you know, because global housing issues are a symptom of inequality and dysfunction of internal markets, can you address just a little bit the of inequality in trade and wealth tax? You mentioned it, but maybe add.
Thank you, Caroline, for this question. I really share, you know, this view on the challenges of taxation in cities in Africa. Let me give you one example. For example, Kisumu, UN Habitat has done with UNCDF, you know, this evaluation of the own source revenue. And we realized that up to now, 70% only of the local revenue has been tapped. All the rest just missing from the nature, which is showing a potential, you know, of revenue at the city's level. But what we need, I think, is institutional support, technical support. Right now, we see, you know, how this technology is changing, you know, the tax payment and others, but also how much people are in a role, you know, of this of the taxation system, you know, in terms of building, in terms of rental and others. I think there's quite a, you know, as you mentioned, the elephant in the room, a huge gap that need to be filled in terms of, you know, harvesting, you know, this value related to housing and land as well at the same time, because how many people are paying land taxation in others, and this of course can serve, you know, filling the gap in terms of inequality. But unfortunately, I think the issue is more about trust, mutual trust between citizen and government, but also the issue of governance, which is related as well, because we see this taxation system, you know, giving advantage to some communities against others, or to some hierarchy people against others. I think those are some elements maybe we need to look at. But of course, I believe that It's not about looking into loan outside, but there's some potential we have in cities and municipalities, but we need to work with our create this capacity and national framework required to be able to harvest, this potential of taxation system at the city level. Over. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Now we obviously could have much more time for debate. This is just such a wonderful group of people, and I really appreciate all of you and the way your interventions link with each other, but also add new elements. And we have more questions that have to do with sharing some of this information going forward, sharing some of the data that was here today. So we will continue. We have the emails of the people who registered. This will be available online. That we want to wrap up at this point, giving a chance to each of our panelists to just reiterate a very brief 2 or 3 words, even just keep yourself to one sentence only. What would be your main takeaway from this session today? A main recommendation or a main lesson that we learned together? And I'll ask you to be very brief and just maybe add one sentence. And if I may, maybe I'll reverse the order. And at this point, we'll start with the EU and work our way back, and maybe if I may, can you just say one very brief sentence? What would be your takeaway?
Okay, I've written my sentence here as I was just thinking about it. So to deliver social housing to scale, it cannot be done by developers or governments alone, and the best they can do is to become facilitators of communities and households in managing incremental construction. This would be, so basically, facilitate communities and households, incremental construction would be the summary of that.
Great. Lars, could you share a main takeaway?
For me, I think get partnerships like this and others working and foster common change.
Thank you. Umar, do you want to share one sentence lesson for
4P.
today?
4P. Public, private, people partnership.
That's a very brief, good title for all of us. Johan, what would be your sentence?
Approach complexity in a collaborative and applied manner, and do it now.
Do it now. Kecia.
Partnerships to scale depend on sharing information and experiences.
Yeah. Anaclaudia.
Yeah, I would go for the hardcore. So we need to unlock land. This requires hard political choices and changes, and therefore we need to evolve from collaboration and partnerships towards structured governance mechanisms where we amplify the number of stakeholders that are part of the decision-making process of the land in the cities and the policy at the national level.
Thank you. And so Jane, what would be your one line?
My one line has been repeated severally, but however, I'll still say it. Partnerships are key to deepen and scale the initiatives that we have, but also knowing that the challenge and the problem is now. It's not waiting for tomorrow. So we need to be very urgent in doing these things.
Yeah. Rick, you welcomed us all and opened, and what would be now a main takeaway that you would share wrapping up this round?
Thank you. It's probably a common theme. I think it's a challenge to us, and then as to how we inspire governments, corporations, civil society. Sometimes our partnerships are transactional. They need to be very strategic, and we all need to give up something as well. So again, thanks to everybody, and look forward to making that a reality.
Yeah, lots of common messages. We definitely want to continue partnering. We've talked about the fact today that housing is a very broad sector. It's linked to financing, it's linked to policies and laws and land tenure and how to approach the whole urban development model, innovative products and new types of creation of enterprises. So moving forward, we just want to encourage all of you and our public to keep in touch. We will post a video of this session that you can share for others who were not available at this hour. And we're extremely grateful for all of our panelists and your contributions. Thank you to Habitat for Humanity for hosting this webinar. We do want to announce at this point that there'll be another webinar March 5th, and we hope you will join. It's called The Relevance of Housing in the Urban Sector in the Africa-EU Partnership, a policy discussion. So that one will move more in the direction of policies. There'll also be EU representatives, representative from the African Union Commission and others. We hope you will all keep in touch. We hope we will continue to receive your documents and share some of these tools and best practices. There'll be another session webinar later in March. The date is still to be announced, which will look at the SDGs and how housing can really help us accomplish the SDGs. I don't know, Yuri, if you wanted to say a closing word?
Just a small correction that the next one is next Thursday, 4th of March at 12 o'clock Brussels time, Central European time.
And so that's the policy discussion. We really hope you will join us. A lot of important issues to discuss there also. And in the meantime, hope all of you continue to take care of yourselves, wear your masks, keep your distance, wash your hands. We hope you all stay safe, and we look forward to seeing you again very soon. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Caroline. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.